Will Eisner is a national treasure. Here is a man who was there at the very creation of the comic book, and when it was simply a form of entertainment for children. He had a vision that you could take this form in a direction that would make it artistically powerful and respectable.
Will Eisner é um mestre dos quadrinhos. Em mais de 60 anos de carreira, ele foi fundamental na conquista do reconhecimento para esse meio de expressão que já foi considerado entretenimento descartável.
My impression of Will Eisner's body of work is that I have been privileged to know a genius. When you not only read his own work and it stands on its own merits, but you look at the generation of cartoonists who have been taught by this master, from Jules Feiffer to Art Spiegelman to Jeff Smith today. These creators would not be who they are without the guidance and firm hand of Will Eisner.
By the time I found my own voice, that influence was very, very sublimated in the rest of the work. Although I would say that even in Mouse, where Eisner was not at the front of my brain, there are panels here and there, like one panel early in the first book of Mouse, where a ticket is bought to go from Sosnowiec to Częstochowa. And the ticket is shown in the panel with a caption explaining that my father went back to this town where the woman who's going to become his wife lived. And this, putting a caption inside a ticket, rather than inside a little regular box, but something that looked like a train ticket, has a very specific pedigree. It's Eisner's approach to finding all of these different strange things that can become a panel, so that a postage stamp can be a panel of a comic, poster on a wall, a window, kind of cannibalizing of all other visual metaphors and forms to make his own comic book stories. This certainly was a very strong thing for me.
So not only do we have his own creative energy and focus and force, but he has passed along this energy to another generation. And to me, that's really the pinnacle of greatness. He not only does it for himself, but he does it for others.
I think, in essence, what he was doing was he was paving the way. I mean, he could have set up a toll booth there, and as all the rest of us came up over the horizon, running toward the territory he'd already opened up, and he could have charged a hell of a toll, but he was so generous. It's just like, hey, come on, jump in the water's fine.
Criador do Spirit, autor de diversas novelas gráficas, Eisner é um desenhista de traço brilhante, mas que se preocupa primordialmente com a qualidade da história que se propõe a contar.
Hello?
Will's point is well taken, which is beautiful art alone is not enough. And as he often says, there are, in the comics field, many people who are regarded as cartoonists who really are illustrators or decorators. They're not really storytellers. And a true cartoonist really has to do both.
Will é um profissional completo, que se reinventa constantemente.
I mean, he always has projects going. His mind is always creating, which I admire.
The fact that somebody at 80 is as enthusiastic about comics as he is, and as energetic as he is, and produces more work than most of the 25-year-olds and 40-year-olds that I know, is an admirable thing. Because comics used to be considered a young man's game.
I think comics are a universal language. Certainly, his work has been translated into, I think, a dozen or 14 languages at this point. But I think one of the reasons he has been translated, probably more than any other American cartoonist, is that he has this universal voice.
profissão cartunista traz o mestre à prancheta para uma aula sobre quadrinhos e o que o próprio Eisner convencionou chamar de arte sequencial.
For example, a cartoonist working in this medium must understand architecture. He must understand a certain amount of sociological interactions between human beings, a little bit of psychology. He must understand physics, such as the law of gravity and the movement of force and counterforce. A young cartoonist or someone entering this business must develop for himself a broad view of life. He must understand human experience and human interaction. He must understand how people respond. He must understand something about life itself. In fact, in this medium, nothing is done accidentally. It's different from painting a canvas where accidents happen, paint splashes or ink leaks, and the artist makes something out of it. The artist in this medium does not discover images while he works. Rather, he must have the image firmly in his mind before he begins.
A primeira ferramenta desse profissional versátil é o conhecimento das teorias e técnicas das artes plásticas.
Essentially, the experience I had in art school, I had a scholarship to the Art Students League. And there I acquired really the basic fundamental knowledge that helped me throughout my career. I studied with George Bridgman. He taught me anatomy. What I learned about anatomy then helped me throughout my entire career because I'm dealing essentially with people, and emotions are transmitted by posture and gesture. The knowledge of anatomy remains very integral to my style, my technique, and actually to my storytelling, because again, human beings transmit their emotions by their anatomical positions. So once you understand that, you can then better display and employ the actors within the stories that you're telling. This is a portrait of my father, which I painted while I was a student at the Art Students League. I was working under Robert Brackman at the time. My father was a tremendous influence on me. He encouraged me throughout my career from the very first. Father came to this country from Austria in 1915, just before World War I. He had been in Vienna. He was a painter of scenery, interior of churches he was doing this, with cherubim and clouds and so forth. When he came to this country, his first job was to work for the Yiddish Art Theater on 2nd Avenue, where he painted scenery. He used to bring me down to the theater while he was working on his long, high ladder, and I sat there watching him paint. I compose my scenes as though I am a director of live theater. Each of the panels for me is a stage. I don't think of movies, I think of live theater, and I attribute that to the influence of my father.
Ser ou não ser? Eis a questão.
His cartooning is brilliant. It takes reality, to me, and emphasizes certain things. It's acting. It's like stage acting, as opposed to film or TV, which is completely up close. And
when I was at the Art Students League, my mother objected strenuously to my going. She couldn't understand why the school would allow a young 16-year-old boy to paint naked women. And she always bothered my father about it. He tried to explain to her that was all right. Anyway, she took the portrait after I brought it home and covered it with an apron and put it away in the closet. I never saw it again until about 2 years after I was married. We were fixing up a new house. myself and my wife, and my mother came up with this thing all wrapped up and gave it to my wife and said, look, now that you are married, now that he's a married man, it'll be all right for you to hang this picture in the room.
Se a influência paterna se faz sentir na formação do jovem Will, sua mãe também foi fundamental. Ela queria que Will fosse um próspero homem de negócios e não um artista. Isso acrescentou mais uma dimensão na personalidade de Eisner.
Remember, I have two sides to me. I'm schizophrenic. I have one foot under the desk and the other foot under the drawing board. I've enjoyed business. I enjoy the business side of it.
Well, besides the romantic notions about being a cartoonist, there are also the very practical aspects. Speaking as a publisher, one of the most important is meeting a deadline. In the nearly 30 years I've known Will Eisner, he has never missed a deadline. In fact, he usually is early when he turns his material in. And I wish that the much younger cartoonists I had were to emulate this professionalism of his. Will understands that art is art, business is business, and the two must connect. And if you're irresponsible, it has a ripple effect on other people.
Many years ago, I had a partner, a financial partner. We were both invested in this company. I started producing a couple of books. This was after I'd sold my company. And he said, do we have a publisher for distribution for this? I said, no. He said, well, do you know who's going to distribute it? I said, I don't know yet. So he said, that's a good way to go to the poorhouse. I said, that's a good name for a company. And so we called it Poorhouse Press.
We will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
When I was drafted, I really hoped that I would be able to go as a foreign correspondent out into the war area. But it turned out that I wasn't. I spent the entire war in the Pentagon building.
Em 1942, Will começou a desenvolver um trabalho inédito de quadrinhos de treinamento.
I created a character called Joe Dope and a whole series of other stories.
Para ter a linguagem do quadrinho aceita num ambiente conservador como o Exército, Eisner teve que travar sua própria batalha.
Whose method of conducting a training manual was done in a language that was very biblical. They had their own language, and they never used drawings, they always used photographs. And so the comics was considered very undignified and very unmilitary. And the adjutant general, who was the division of the Army in charge of training manuals at that time, put up a tremendous fight and tried to stop it. The advantage you have with drawings, unlike photography, is that you can manipulate the perspective to suit the reader. Always in my shop, the one rule we had was that when you are doing showing an installation, installing a valve or installing a widget of some kind, the point of view of this thing is just as though the reader was actually in the truck or in the equipment doing it.
I think that the educational comics Will did are, in their own way, as important as the entertaining comics that we probably all prefer to read. But what Will proved is that comic books can be effective educational tools. And this really was only a theory until Will tested and improved it with his PS magazine.
when the war ended, I got a call from somebody at United States Steel, one of the big steel companies. He said, "Are you doing the same thing in civilian life that you did in the Army?" And of course, I'm very enterprising. I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Well," he said, I said, "as a matter of fact, I'm starting such a company this week." "Oh," he said, "good. Come to see me."
O que o Eisner andou fazendo assim, depois que o Spirit acabou, nem tudo a gente sabe, né? Porque ele começou a fazer propagandas, coisas educativas, coisas para o governo. Então, isso não foi publicado na grande imprensa, né? Esses são manuais e pequenas coisas assim que para um público específico. Nessas histórias que o Eisner fez para campanhas institucionais, tem uma que ele fez para a Telefônica de Nova York, ou algo que o valha. E era mostrando, está vendo? A linha plana é melhor do que a pulsa. Ele conseguiu transformar isso numa história.
Socorro! Polícia!
Eventualmente, Eisner retornaria a trabalhar com o Pentágono, produzindo a revista PS.
Occasionally, I would get criticism from my more liberal friends, particularly the ones that I knew while I was in school, because when I was in high school, I was very radical, and I hung around with revolutionary kids. And so many years later, they still get in touch with me, and they said, "How can you produce work for the military? You are a merchant of death." And I pointed out to them that what I was doing was teaching men how to save their lives. I wasn't necessarily teaching them how to kill. I'm very proud of what I did. The best thing I can tell you is that one day during, I was visiting the Pentagon building, and a fellow came up to me and said, "You know," he said, "I just came in from combat in the Korean War." And he said, "Your magazine saved my neck." And he said, "I should thank you, because that is the best praise I could have gotten."
Os livros técnicos de Eisner começam a nascer em 1972, quando Will é convidado a lecionar na Escola de Artes Visuais de Nova York.
He asked me what I would call the class to school. I said, "You should call it sequential art, because I think comics is a bad word and it doesn't really mean it." They said, "Okay." Well, that year when they printed the catalog said sequential art, and in parentheses they had the word comics. So they couldn't get away from it.
He not only is able to do the work, he's able to articulate how he did it and inspire the younger generation.
Tudo começou nos anos 50, quando o grupo de desenhistas, que seria o Alex Raymond, o Al Foster, o Milton Caniff, criaram uma escola para ensinar a fazer história em quadrinhos. Desde esse período, os artistas americanos começaram a se interessar em lecionar histórias em quadrinhos. E o Will Eisner se transformou em um professor importante em Nova York. O André LeBlanc era o assistente dele.
The School of Visual Arts in New York City was once called the Cartoonist and Illustrator School. So it had a strong DNA toward teaching comics. And each of these cartoonists, Kurtzman, Eisner, and myself, had very different approaches as to how to go about teaching that sort of thing.
Teaching the subject really congealed in my mind the disciplines of the medium. And I realized then that it could be taught as a regular discipline. And so I began writing a series of essays around the teaching of this medium, which I ultimately collected or congealed into a book.
Os dois livros técnicos de Eisner foram editados pela sua Poor House Press. O primeiro, Quadrinhos e Arte Sequencial, chegou a ser lançado no Brasil.
A arte sequencial do Will Eisner realmente, mais uma vez, é uma obra que quem quer fazer história em quadrinhos, ou desenhar história em quadrinhos, chega aqui, onde é que tem uma escola, onde é que dá para fazer, eu saber como é que se faz. Eu mando fazer duas coisas. Uma, logicamente, é ler as minhas revistas, continuar lendo. E a outra, dá uma olhada no livro do Will Eisner, Quadrinhos, Arte Sequencial. Está tudo aqui.
He's written several books that are just as influential with the younger artists. The art of graphic storytelling and sequential art. They're both probably the most best thought out and the best books I could recommend for young cartoonists.
O próprio Roberto Duailib, que é um dos donos da DPZ, ele é o D da DPZ, ele me falou assim, esse livro, embora ensine história em quadrinhos, ele é muito útil para o pessoal de publicidade e o pessoal que faz filme comercial, porque ele, de uma certa forma, ensina a fazer um storyboard, quer dizer, como contar uma história com algumas imagens, com som, com balãozinho e tudo.
Contar histórias é um comportamento social básico do ser humano.
And what Will has done and shown in his books about how to do these things is to get the clearest information across to the reader so that there's not any sense of ambivalence or ambiguity.
Moi, ce qui me frappe le plus, c'est l'écriture. C'est-à-dire que c'est quelqu'un qui écrit littéralement la bande dessinée, dont le texte, le dessin, le phylactère, l'onomatopée, tout est au service du récit. Il n'y a pas de décrochage.
Os quadrinhos são uma forma de leitura, onde as letras são elas próprias imagens, com significados que se adicionam àquele que o texto transmite.
Vim à sua casa como um amigo e você me assassinou. Por isso, que sua gente seja paralisada pela mancha do meu sangue.
Balloons are really encompass dialogue. We call it balloons, Italians call it fumetti, some people call it bubbles. And dialogue is really a very difficult thing to show because it really leaves no image. When I speak, it shows no image. Actually, the Italians, by calling it fumetti, give it the best characteristic because when people speak, the words, as the words come out, if in a cold room there's steam.
Minhas palavras não podem ser vistas. Minhas palavras não podem ser vistas.
Balloons take various shapes. A standard balloon is an ordinary enclosed shape which has an ordinary undisturbed surface. When you want to show something technical or electronic, you use a jagged balloon. In the same balloon, you can change the sound by having large letters. The size of the letter and the character of the letter has a lot to do with the sound that you're trying to get the reader to emulate in his or her mind. The lettering that goes inside the balloons, which is part of the dialogue, are, in my opinion, very integral to the entire style and ambiance of the artwork. There's a humanity in the irregularity of the balloons. So I believe very strongly in having the lettering very much a part of the artist's style.
Embora já tenha dirigido um estúdio com vários artistas, hoje Eisner trabalha sem assistentes. Todas as fases do processo levam seu toque pessoal. A prática do mercado é outra.
Someone who does the penciling, you have someone who does the inking, and this person's a colorist, and this person's the writer, and this person's the plotter, and there's this sense that you're making a product.
I do my own lettering. I do everything. I make everything except the paper I buy. Actually, I'm pretty fast still. I still can compete with the other young Turks. I can produce about a page a day, pencil and ink. I generally write the whole book before and do it in dummy form, pencil roughs, and then I copy them and redo them for the final finished form.
Talvez o maior diferencial de Eisner seja sua qualidade como escritor. Ele cresceu e se formou em uma época menos audiovisual e mais literária. De que maneira se conta uma história?
Como a notícia de um evento.
Exceto que o narrador controla o evento.
During the 30s, when I was growing up, the major popular literature was short stories. America was very strong on short stories at the time, and the men that influenced me were really O. Henry, Saki, Ring Lardner. In France, de Maupassant's stories were very, very influential. I remember them very well. All of them really taught me how to do a short story.
Escrever para quadrinhos pode ser bem mais difícil do que parece.
When I started writing my own work again, Bill Sienkiewicz, the artist, would get angry with Bill Sienkiewicz, the writer, saying, I mean, what is this you're giving me here? How can I work with this? And I think there's a tendency to write way too much, like some writers do, or to repeat what the visuals are doing. You know, so-and-so walks, you know, comes in through the window, and the caption saying, so-and-so, you know, came through the window. The redundancy level is ridiculous.
O percurso de leitura em uma página é uma convenção compreendida entre o autor e o leitor. Mas não é possível impedir que o leitor leia logo o fim da história. Nesse meio de expressão, não é possível controlar a velocidade do leitor, nem a ordem de páginas ou quadrinhos que ele lê.
I maintain that in the process of turning the page, the reader, you lose a millisecond of reader attention. Consequently, you cannot, in my opinion, stop the action at the bottom of a page in midstream. You must contain an action almost like a scene in a play.
A passagem do tempo nos quadrinhos também tem que ser representada de maneira bem específica.
Sei lá, será que ele estava mesmo bêbado? Não senti cheiro de bebida. Vai ver que estava morto.
The perceptive time, or the perception of time, or timing as I call, that has to do with the way the action is arranged on a given page. You have to support it by a device that the reader is familiar with, like a clock or the dropping of water. In this medium, it is almost impossible to surprise the reader because you have absolutely no control over which panel the reader will read first. If someone opens a page, he reads the last panel first, then he goes to the first panel. So what you do is you force the surprise to the character. You bring the surprise to the character itself. When the lead character is surprised, the reader becomes surprised too.
Esta linguagem recorre frequentemente às imagens sem palavras, ou pantomimas. No uso da anatomia expressiva, Eisner codifica o uso de gestos e postura corporal para representar os estados emocionais que deseja expressar.
The clearest way to evoke human emotion is to demonstrate body movement, or what we call gesture and posture. Again, we're dealing with a medium that has difficulty in demonstrating internalism. We attempt to capture that by emulating human emotions. Human beings demonstrate emotion more effectively with their total body than they do with their face. For example, on a given face, you might have a face like this, but if that person does not have the rest of the body, you aren't able to demonstrate the full emotion. In this case, both these people have the same facial expression, but their body has betrayed it totally differently. You don't have to show the face at all to show what a person is feeling. You can take, let me draw a picture of a man from behind. Now this is the back view of that person. I can demonstrate that person's feelings by purely a body posture.
As imagens são ferramentas narrativas. Personagens parecidos com animais evocam nos leitores os sentimentos associados a estes animais.
Face in itself is a map, and the face is in movement at all times. As a matter of fact, one of the important things to understand in drawing faces is that the surface of a face is in constant movement, and what happens with your eyebrows affects what happens with the rest of your face.
Para uma comunicação eficaz, os quadrinhos utilizam imagens universalmente reconhecidas que imitam e exageram a realidade. São os estereótipos. Eles apelam à experiência do leitor através da simplificação das imagens em símbolos altamente repetitíveis. Nas capas das republicações do Spirit, Eisner recuperou o gosto pela ilustração como um fim em si, depois de décadas colocando sua arte sempre a serviço de histórias. Posteriormente, Will viria a lançar um livro de esquetes, além de portfólios de arte e litogravuras.
First and foremost, although Will tends to disregard this, his style is beautiful. His rendering, what we artists call feathering with the brush, when the edge of the brush leaves a delicate line, and sometimes parallel and sometimes they're broad strokes, sometimes delicate strokes, but his control over the brush is a marvelous thing because it's both spontaneous and precise. And this is a rare combination among artists. So
no seu estúdio em Tamarack, Flórida, Eisner demonstra sua técnica com o pincel e fala de luz e sombra.
Anything that is soft like cloth or people's human skin, I prefer to use a brush. This is a sable brush. I like a sable brush. This is Kolinsky hair, very fine sable. I use a number 3. It's a number 3, which is not very big. It's quite small. It creates a fine line. I like fine lines. I like to work on a fine line. I prefer working in black and white, largely because the black and white line is closest to actual text. It's in itself a language. And I believe that color affects the surface of the material, but not the internal aspect. For my kinds of stories, where I'm dealing with internalisms, where I'm dealing with subtle posture and gesture, and human emotion, I prefer to remain in black and white.
Hả? Hả?
I'm assuming that there's a strong light coming from the other side. And the trouble with shadow is that it obliterates a lot of the things you saw there, the nice soft lines you saw there. The detail you saw will disappear into the shadow, obviously. So when you said put shadows on this, I changed the light. But it does, what light does is adds drama, because human beings react to light. They find light comfortable, and shadows are frightening. And that's why we do use shadows to create a sense of mystery, an air of terror, fear. And shadows, for me, I block the shadow out into a general shape, and then I fill it in. Generally, I use what they call feathering, which is a way of breaking up the shadow in little molecules of light, little bars of light. This is something I learned from a famous painter called Charles Leyendecker, who was a famous illustrator during the 30s. Shadows are a result of the flow of light. They are the negative result. And once I have established the direction of the light, the shadows automatically fall into place.
Nas mais de 600 histórias do Spirit, Will Eisner criou uma tradição. A primeira página de cada história era sempre especial e graficamente única, de grande efeito. É a chamada splash page.
Will clearly wasn't a lazy cartoonist. In addition to having to come up with a 7-page story idea every week and to have to draw it every week on a very tight deadline, he gave himself an additional burden, which was to come up with an innovative way to work in his logo. And I think for Will it was perhaps the equivalent of the beginning of a movie, which has to suck you into the plot before you see the titles.
It's really no different than if you are in a living room with a group of people and you're about to tell them a story. You set the scene for them, you tell them the whole story, and then you go into the details. After this, the story is told in a series of panels with close-ups and long shots and so forth.
Will reconstruiu em estúdio a splash page que concebeu para a aventura do Spirit, The Last Trolley Car, ou O Último Bonde.
The splash page generally encompasses a summary of the whole story. So what I try to do is to summarize in one big scene the nature of the story, the mood of the story, and the main theme of the story. It is really a mood page rather than an information page. The perspective would be directed from above, and the buildings would establish the perspective. In the case of the Spirit, I always integrated the logo, the title, with the nature of the story itself. When a vehicle is moving, it creates air and papers fly, and I took the logo, made paper out of it, and floated it.
Com o avanço da televisão, jogos eletrônicos, internet e outras tecnologias, muitos se perguntam: como será o futuro dos quadrinhos?
Up until a few years ago, the world of comics was growing tremendously. Last 3 or 4 years, it has suddenly imploded. First of all, comics as a literary form have not yet achieved the acceptance of straight literature.
In general, comic book sales have been declining for several years in a row. The younger readers who used to embrace comics now embrace video games and are surfing the web.
Comics have lost their novelty. There was a time when simply being a comic was enough. It no longer is that case. In the pursuit of the audience, a lot of comic books are producing what I call high-tech, high-impact comics, in which the story is unimportant, only the effect. It's like special effects in movies.
When TV came out, it would replace movies. When movies came out, it would replace, silence or books. Photography, for a while, replaced illustration. Everything goes in cycles. I do believe that people need to feel something in their hands. They want to hold on to something.
Sometimes I worry if there will be a 21st century of comics as things move on to electronic media and beyond. On the other hand, if there is such a thing as literature, certainly there's room for literature in pictures.
Na missão de adaptar os quadrinhos de Eisner para a linguagem da mídia eletrônica, a equipe de profissão cartunista se baseou na adaptação de Will Eisner para o clássico de Herman Melville, Moby Dick, A Baleia Branca. Quadrinhos para TV é assim.
When I got here, I discovered now why you have invited me. It's very appropriate that for a 100-year celebration, you've invited the oldest living cartoonist in the United States. So I ask you, Mr. Mayor, on the next centennial, please invite me again. By then, I'll be old enough.